Jai Hind all of you once again. I am Manish Kumar, Assistant Professor in Department of Computer Science and Engineering at Akgec Engineering College. So, today I am in front of you to brief you about my 5th lecture on web technology series, that is Servlet. Okay. So, today I am going to introduce about the Servlet. So, let me introduce. We all know that in web technology we use number of technologies. We use number of hypertext languages. For example, HTML we use. ठीक है, hypertext for making our web pages, to develop number of web pages, number of websites. Then we put some effects, special effects on our that web page with the help of CSS that we have already studied, right? Then some scripting is done. Scripting means we do some validations on those web pages. We put some input information in our database, we save information in our database with some validations. So, we do some connectivity and store those information on our database. We do the JDBC connectivity, right? So, we use scripting language. Then nowadays at backend, at server side, we use the concept of Node.js we use, that we have studied in last lecture, last topic. Okay. Now I am briefing you about server side technology that is called as Servlet. So, although I can say that this is a older version, nowadays we use Node.js, but we should know what is the purpose of using Servlet, how it is helpful in doing that server side programming, right. So, for this we should have to take some see some architecture. So this is the content that I am going to brief today. That firstly we will see what is Servlet, right. Then we will see architecture, what is the architecture of Servlet, okay. Interface Servlet, what is mean by interface Servlet, and most important we will discuss about the life cycle of servlets, right. Then how we are going to handle HTTP request, HTTP response, post request, how we use redirected request to other sources, how session tracking is done, what is the concept of cookies, right. Session tracking is done how with the help of HTTP sessions. So, today I am brief you all these topics. Now, first of all we should know what is this Servlet, why we use it, why we call it Servlet. Okay. So, as I told you that this technology is server side technology, so it is used to create web application, right. So, what is the purpose of web application? We know that there are a number of applications where we take some information from the user and we store it on server, right. And in future we use to retrieve that information. Like there are a number of applications. For example, we have seen online shopping carts are there, banking applications were there. So, all there we can use the servlet programming, right. So, we will create a web application, number one, and that web application is going to reside on server side. This is important, okay. And after some time we will going to retrieve that information from the server. It means we will generate dynamic web pages, right. So, server technology is robust and scalable. Why I have used this robust and scalable? Scalable and robust means we are using Java language, okay. Now, before we going to study Servlet, previously we use a technology, a scripting language that is called as CGI, that is Common Gateway Interface, right. So, we will see a brief difference between what is the difference between Servlet and what is the difference between Servlet and CGI. We will see a brief difference, okay. So, because before Servlet, this CGI is the popular server side programming language, but there are number of disadvantages. So, we are not going to focus this CGI, we have to just focus on Servlet, okay. So, servlets, what are servlets? So, we briefly define this Servlet as Java programs that will run on Java enabled web server, okay, Java enabled web server. So, first of all, as we know that we do some programming, Java programming on some editor, right. Then we need to install some web server like Tomcat, Apache Tomcat server we will install, okay. Then with the help of some IDE, we can use any of the IDE, NetBeans we can use IDE, we can use the nowadays there is one of the popular IDE in students that is called as Visual Visual Studio VS Code, right? So any of that IDEs can be used to do programming, okay? But server, we used to store server because we know that servlet is yes, servlet is server side programming language, okay? And with the help of that, the information that is stored on server is retrieved dynamically, right? So servlets are the, we can say that servlets are the Java programs, okay? And those Java programs run on Java enabled web server, or we can say that Java enabled application server, okay? So what is the purpose of this Java enabled application server? Because what happened when a client sends some request to a server, we all know that a client server architecture is there. We have already know there is a client, you have several times studied this, there is one server is there. So this is a client machine, and what happened, this client will send a request to server, right? Then server will respond, it will give some response, right? So first request is sent, on the basis of that request server will send some response according to the query asked by the client, right? So there is a simple client server architecture is there. So these servlets, these Java programs were used to handle the request to obtain from the web server, right? And what happened, request is sent to the server, then that request will be processed by the server, process the request, number 2, okay? Then after processing the request, response is produced, right? Response is produced, then send a response back to the web server. For example, you can say that some acknowledgement is generated like that, okay? So now next, properties of servlets can be as follows. Number 1, we all have to keep in mind servlet work on server side. Number 1, this is very important, work on server sides, okay? So servlets are capable of handling complex request, as I have shown in this diagram. There is a client server architecture is there, client will send the request, and after processing the request, the server will send the response. So what happened? So second important property, servlets are capable of handling complex request obtained from the web server, okay? So servlets can be described in many ways depending on the context, in which context we are developing a application, right? So servlet is a technology. What type of technology? Now I think it is clear, server side technology. Servlet is server side technology. That is, server side technology means it is used to create a web application, okay? Right? So next is servlet in an API. API is application programming interface that will provides many interfaces and classes, okay? Servlet is an API. We can say that it is also an API which gives us number of interfaces and number of classes. Also it also include number of documentation, including documentations, okay? So servlet is an interface, right, that must be implemented for creating any servlet. What is servlet? Servlet means a Java program. It can be work as an interface, right? Interface means, interface is defined as a agreement between two parties, okay? Now servlet is a class, interfaces and classes. So number 1, I have told you, it is at an interface. What is the purpose of interface? Interface that must implement some creating any servlet. And what is classes? Servlet is a class that extends the capabilities of the server. So with the help of that class will consist of number of methods, okay? And it will extend the capability of the server and respond to the incoming request, right? Because we know that request is sent to a server, okay? So servlet is a web component that is deployed on the servlet. So servlet is a web component that is deployed on the server. So why we call it a web document? Because here we are going to create dynamic web pages. So it is called as a web component, right? So 2-3 things you must keep in mind. Servlet is a technology. What type of technology? Server side technology, number 1, okay? Servlet is an API. API means it will provide interfaces and classes, right? Interfaces means is an interface that implement for creating a servlet, ठीक है, and classes means extend the capability of the server, ठीक है, because we are going to handle dynamic web pages, ठीक है. So with the help of this diagram, this is simple client server architecture diagram, ठीक है. So client will send a request. Number one, request is sent. To whom this request is sent? Request is sent to a server, right? Then server will process this request, ठीक है. So what server will do? Server will give response. Response is generated at runtime, ठीक है, and that response is received by this client. Response is sent to the client. So this is a simple diagrammatical view. With this diagram, you can explain the role of servlet. Okay, why we call it server side, why we call it technology, what is the role of interfaces, what is the role of classes, why we call it API. So all these things can be explained with the help of this single diagram. Okay, right. Now this is all about introduction, and now the architecture. So we have just seen a client server architecture is there. So I have just elaborated in the form of this diagram कि this is a web browser, ठीक है. So how the client will send the request to server? With the help of web browser, right? So something user has, that client has typed something on a web browser, and that is sent as a request to a web server, and that request is called as HTTP. What is HTTP? HTTP is a protocol, right? Hypertext transfer protocol, right? So this protocol will use to interpret the terms, interpret the language, interpret the code which we see on our web page, right? So this HTTP request is sent, received by server. Then there is some servlet program. As we have told that this servlet program is a Java program, right? And which is programmed at server side. So there is some program, that program will handle that request, process that request. After processing that request, with the help of this program, the information will be retrieved from the database, and in response, this server will generate response to a web browser. So that same diagram I have shown here, ठीक है, using the terms web browser, HTTP request, number one, ठीक है, send to web server. Then web server, there is some program is there, Java program is there, that we call it a servlet program, and that program is responsible of connecting that. This is acting as a API. I have told that, है ना, API, application programming interface, and that information retrieved from the database, then server will send the response to web browser. Okay. Now, so these are the 6 basic steps that you all have to keep in mind, how this execution of servlet takes place. So this is important. These 6 steps are important. Although these steps will consist of that the steps that are executed on client server architecture same. So number one, what will happen? Number one, the client send the request to the web browser, that we have already seen. Okay, this is a simple theoretical representation in steps that we have seen in a diagram. Okay, so number one, the client send the request to the web server, right? Then web server receives the request. After receiving, what will happen? And some Java program is there, that is servlet program is there. Then web server passes that request to the servlet, right? Why it passes? For the processing, further processing. And number 4 is the servlet processes the request, right, and generates the response in the form of output. Okay. Then number 5, the servlet sends the response back to the web server, and then web server send response to the client. Number 6, the web server sends the response back to the client, and the client browser displays it on the screen. Okay. So depending on the requirement, depending on the user, whether user 1 is there, user 2 is there, user 3 is there, that response is given. So that's why we have called that dynamic web pages. So dynamically it will return the response dynamically to the client. Okay. So these are the steps, important steps. This in examination, this question is asked several times. Okay. So what is the advantages of servlet? Although we have seen that it is portable, we have seen it is robust, it is secure, and it is good. We use for the better performance, so that communication between that server and client will take place securely, right? So there are a number of advantages. So when we talk about advantages, then we will compare it with previously used scripting language that is called as CGI, right? So there are number of advantages of servlet over CGI. Okay, as we know that the web container creates threads for handling the multiple requests to the servlet. So threads have a lot of benefits over the processes, such as they share a common memory area. Common memory area is there. Lightweight. Okay, cost of communication between the threads are low. Overhead is very less. So these are the basic benefits. Communication overhead is low, lightweight, memory area. So this will result in the better performance. Okay, better performance because it creates a thread for each request. Create a thread for each request, not process. Portability because it uses Java language. Portability. Okay, Java enabled. Robust is servlets are managed by JVM, Java Virtual Machine. So need not to worry about memory leak or garbage collection. Okay, secure because it uses Java language that we have already studied in the features of Java. Ki Java is secure. Okay, so if you see in this diagram, so you can see that there are a number of requests were there, and each request is handled by, for every request there is a thread, separate thread is there, right? So this will result in better performance. Okay, so this is a web container. As we know that servlet is server side, so web server is there and some Java program is there to handle that request. So for every request, individual thread is generated, that web container will generate, and it is given to our Java program. Okay, so overall load on the processor is less, right? So the server side extensions are nothing but the technologies that are used to create dynamic web pages. Every time we are using this word dynamic web pages. Okay, na? Actually, to provide the facility of dynamic web pages need a container or web server. As we have shown in this diagram, this web container is there, and that web container, this servlet programming servlet is there. Okay, na? So we can say that it will provide a facility of dynamic web pages. Okay, so to meet this requirement, independent web server that will provide API in the form of API, right? So that already we have discussed. Right? So what happened, this API which allows us to build a program that can run with a web server. Okay, so in this case we have Java. Okay, so servlet is also one of the component APIs of Java platform enterprise edition that we called JEE, Java enterprise JEE, J2EE, Java 2 enterprise edition. Okay, which sets standard for creating dynamic applications in Java. Okay, so when we talk about servlet, it means we are talking about dynamic web applications. Okay, so before going further, I just want to differentiate between CGI and that servlet. Okay, so I just have a table, leave it this common gateway interface actually application that is written. This is previously we used CGI, right? Then now after that we will use the concept of servlet. So in this diagram you can see just ki we have a client, same client server model is there. We have HTTP request, right? Request is sent to a server. Then what happened? In the case of servlet, there is a servlet program is there, but in case of CGI, we have a CGI application. Okay, and that request is sent to CGI application, and in response, this CGI application will give HTTP response to a server. Okay, then HTTP response to a client. So for each request, a new process will be created. In the case of CGI, for each request, a new process will be created. But in this case of servlet, we have seen that we have individual thread for each request, right? Which will decrease the overload on the processor, right? So this is the major difference. This you can see here that servlets are portable and efficient, that we have already discussed. CGI is not portable. Because not portable, we have seen that. Why it is not portable? Because for each request, a new server process will be created. So we can't say that CGI is portable. Okay? So number one point I have differentiated here. In servlet, sharing data is possible, but in CGI, sharing data is not possible. Right? Servlets can directly communicate with the web server. Right? CGI cannot directly communicate with the web server. Okay? Cannot communicate directly with this web server. There is some CJ application is there, but in this servlet there is a simple Java program, right? Now we discuss about servlet. We are discussing about servlet terminologies. So there are number of terminologies that we need to study. We need to know. There are key points that we need to know whenever we discuss about servlet programming. Okay? For example, what is server, what is client server architecture, what is HTTP request, what is response, right? What is cookies, get, post. There are a number of terminologies that we have to remember. Okay? So for example, there are key points that must know by the servlet programmer, like server. This is key. What is container? What is get request? What is post request? Extra. Okay? So let us discuss these points before starting the servlet technology. Number one is HTTP. What do you mean by HTTP? Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is a protocol which is used to interpret the web pages, right? HTTP request type. Request means whenever a client sends the request to a server, that request is called as HTTP request. Okay? Difference between get and post methods are there. You have seen when you type something on URL, you type something in the www.google.com. Okay? When you put enter, there is some changes you will see in that URL. Okay? So that will depend which method we are going to use at server side. Get method is used or post method is used. Okay? What do you mean by container? Server and difference between web servers, web server and application server. This is also important. What is the difference between web server and application server? What do you mean by content type? And introduction of XML deployment. XML is also there. This is extensible markup language which is used to keep the documents. Okay? Right? So what is HTTP? We all know that this is a type of protocol that allows web servers and browser to exchange data. Simple. Okay? So what type of protocol it is? It is a type of request response protocol. Matlab request is sent to server and response is get. That, as I have already said, that is a type of an interpreter through which web pages can be seen by a client. Okay? So HTTP uses reliable TCP connections by default on TCP port 80. This is the default port of 80, right? It is stateless, means request is considered as a new request. Okay? So you can see with the help of this is simple client server architecture, right? So now these are the number of methods that you can see. There are a number of methods. So a web developer, a web programmer should know all these methods, right? So this is a brief description of these methods. So what the purpose of using of these methods, right? You can see from here. Okay? Get versus post. Get method. What is the purpose of get method? What is the purpose of post method? Post is basically used for large amount of data, and for limited amount of data, get is used. Okay? What is container? Container will gives a type of information that will consist of life cycle management, multi-thread support, object pooling, security. And what is server? There are two types of server: web server and application server, right? So what is web server? Web server is that contains only web or servlet container. Okay? It can be used for servlet, JSP, struts. It cannot be used for EGB. Okay? For example, you have heard about Apache Tomcat, Resin. These are the web server. And what are application server? These JBoss, Glassfish, WebLogic, WebSphere. These are the application server. And what are the content type? These are the content, number of content types. For example, when you shoot a mail to someone, you will see all these contents are, we can add some image also, some applications, right? So we can, GIF files can also be added. This is the content type, okay? This is also known as MIME, right? And number last is XML. So with the help of that respective, so that file can be viewed easily on internet, so we can create an XML file, right? So these are the two APIs that are used in Servlet. So firstly, we will import these packages: javax.servlet, javax.servlet.http, right? So this is the brief introduction that I have just given you here in Servlet. So what are the different types? You just keep in mind here, that is these terminologies. Okay? So thank you for today. Thanks.